Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, and welcome to the Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and try and encourage you or get you to examine yours. So this week I'm going to be playing the third part of the discussion I had with Rob Rowe on Noah's flood and the theory that it's a regional flood. This time we cover a little bit more of the evidence, but mostly get into critiquing and comparing the regional theory versus the worldwide flood theory, which is generally espoused by young Earth creationists. I mean, well, as I think about it, logically you could probably think the Noah's flood was worldwide without being a young Earth creationist, but I'm not aware of anybody who thinks Noah's flood was worldwide who isn't also a young Earth creationist. So even though they don't necessarily go together, they seem to come together a lot. So anyhow, that's what's going on this week, and I'll just dive you right back into Rob and I's discussion.
So it wouldn't, you said it wouldn't be two of every existing creature in the world. It would be two of what are the farm and domesticated animals that they had and used around here at that particular time. Right. And probably wouldn't even have been then all the animals in that region, because we can assume there would be wild animals that aren't domesticated that would have been of no use to the people. In fact, some of them probably would have been pests they would have liked to get rid of. So,
yeah, and you have Josephus saying that humanity actually, there were people that survived the flood. Like he actually quotes from legends, Babylonian legends, and he has no problem. He doesn't refute it. He has no problem with it. So then this leads into other very interesting, more, I mean, it's small, but it's significant sort of argumentations for a local flood, and that is, say, the height of the flood waters. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to say it says 15 cubits. No, sorry, is it 15 cubits? Yeah, 15 cubits.
I don't recall off the top of my head.
But when you translate it into our modern metric system, so to use, say, American metrics, it's 22.5 feet in height. Okay. 22.5 feet. That seems pretty shallow if it's a global flood, first and foremost.
Oh, yeah. There's no way that's going to... I sit much higher than 22 feet above sea level here in Missouri in the United States.
Right. So then younger creationists would say, but it's 22.5 feet above the top of the mountain. So wait a second. Are you telling me that Noah happened to float his reed boat over the top of a particular mountain that's already, the water's covering by 22.5 feet? And it's like, oh, yeah, okay, now we're at the top peak of this mountain, and it is, yes, it's 22.5 feet. Okay, let's record that. Like, then the young creationists would be like, but that's, you're mocking God because God dictated that to Moses, that it's exactly that height. Now, if you look at, say...
It's 22 feet higher than the tallest mountain, which is Mount Everest, you'd know would be, 29,500 feet in the air, which is called the death zone, where people can't even live for longer than a couple of.
So where's the cabin pressure in this reed boat? Like,
no kidding.
So, now Gordon Wenham in his Genesis commentary, the Word Biblical Commentary, argues that actually the covering of the mountain can actually be read a different way. It drenches the mountain by 22.5 feet. Meaning it dresses the mountain up to 22.5 feet. It's not so the word cover there, is it covering the top peaks of a mountain, or is it covering the mountain? Kind of like when you cover yourself, like, I don't know, say you just come out of a shower and you're covering yourself with your towel. Mm-hmm. That language can be nuanced in so many different ways. When I'm just going to cover myself. Right.
I was going to ask you about that anyway, because that's the common objection I get when I brought up this theory to people is they say, well, it just says right there that it covered all the hills and mountains, that it covered everything. So how can it be that it's literally not covering things like Mount Everest?
Right. I find it interesting that if that Persian Gulf is a very flat, low-lying field, plus obviously it being lush, so... and in fact, it's just popped into my mind, which is a question what would the flora be like? What's the height of certain trees in that region at the time? That's actually an interesting question I just thought of. But pretty much when the text is saying 22.5 feet is the water. Now here's what's really fascinating. That 2015 paper said that the waters came at about 21 feet depth in that Persian Gulf flooding region.
That is interesting.
And I'm just going, well, here's a holy text saying it's 22.5 feet, give and take. So
let me just stop you for a sec. How do you think that the Noah or whoever else was observing this flood would have then got an accurate reading of more or less how deep it was? Because I would assume the survivors, if there are any, are running out of the way, trying to get out of the flood. Noah's on the ark. So how is it that was it just essentially divine providence that they got the number right, or did they guess more or less, or what do you think?
Well, that's why it just popped into my mind so the cubit, obviously they had a certain type of measuring. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about an estimation of cubit being the forearm, you could sort of estimate, okay, that palm tree maybe is, I don't know, what, 20 cubits or 20 forearm lengths up or something. I don't know, I'm just throwing a wild guess there.
So there was a tall tree and they knew from
so that's
how tall the tree was, and then they looked and saw where the water was and just kind of figured, okay.
That's what I'm sort of wondering now, if that's the way they were sort of gauging the height of the waters. Now, obviously we don't know, but all that we can get from this is that the text is saying 15 cubits or 22 feet.
Mm-hmm.
The science says about 21 feet in this region.
Very close match.
Remarkably close to 22.5 feet. So, and then you have the grammatical context of drenching the mountains up. It's not 22.5 feet above the mountains. Here's another thing. Why not 30 feet? Why not 50 feet? Why not 100 feet if it's above the mountains? Why does God, if he's flooding the mountain, if it's a global flood, 15 cubits will do? It makes no sense. Why not 10 cubits or 5 cubits? Why does it have to be 15? Now, Old Testament scholars will say, but isn't it interesting that the ark is 30 cubits in height? So I forget the technical terminology for a ship. It's so you need a leeway of depth.
Part of it needs to be underneath the water. Yeah.
In order to accommodate half of 30, which is 15, and so there you go. So are you saying that the ark is just about scraping the tops of mountains? Now it's giving way. It's going to do. Do you see the gymnastics that has to go on to try and defend this type of concordism, which is a younger type of argumentation that tries to concord a younger 6,000-year-old framework? It sounds so goofy when you think about it. It's comical. It's humor.
I've thought for quite a while. When I grew up, as I said, I grew up in a Christian home, and I was taught a very young Earth creationist perspective from the likes of Ken Ham and things like that. Mm-hmm. Although, to be fair, my parents aren't extremely dogmatic about it, even though they still think that way. You can have a conversation with them about it and disagree and walk away and everybody's still friends, which was a very, very good thing, because I know there are a lot of people that you can't do that with. And that was when I started coming out of that, I started looking at that and was convinced young Earth creationists just are not really even attempting to read Genesis in its original context. And now I appreciate that it can be at times very, very difficult to do that. And that's why I think we have so many competing theories like John Walton's, like the way Hugh Ross reads it, and so on and so forth. And I think I intrinsically kind of agree with you that there's probably at least a little bit of truth in almost all of them. Mm-hmm. But the one thing I've learned that you just absolutely cannot do, and this is something I picked up in my English studies when I was getting my bachelor's degree, mm-hmm. you can never read a text well absent from the author's intentions. And it's become very obvious to me that's, although I don't think they're trying to do it, most young Earth creationists absolutely do that. They just do not even try and get into the mindset of what the author of Genesis was and why he would have written things this way as opposed to that way, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's kind of like when somebody wants to interpret one of Shakespeare's plays with third wave feminism. Maybe you can find a way to make it fit, but come on, we know Shakespeare didn't mean that. So
Right, yeah. I think. So as far as the science goes, I think that's probably the best and the latest research I've done on that. There's the Jeffrey Rose interview. I've written extensively on this, and it's on the Google Drive. There's a whole lecture I've made. Obviously, there's an 8-minute summary video I did where I go into more detail about like after the flood happens, the migration of agriculture, from that region onwards, all that stuff. So I think the last sort of defenses I would have for a local flood would now just be purely textual based, and that is the universality language that you see in the flood narrative. So the kol aretz, or kol basad, all flesh, all earth. So, for example, the Pishon River is described as winding through kol aretz, all the earth, kol haaretz. Does this mean that the Pishon River, which is in Genesis 2, is that global? No, it's just a way of saying all this land, which is pretty vast, by the way, the Arabian Peninsula in that region. It's flowing down all this land, all the kol basada, all flesh, in this vicinity. So then the young
literary device, more or less, is what you're saying there.
Sorry.
So what you're saying is when it says all flesh, all the land, it's like a literary device that the author is using.
Exactly.
Kind of like how I might say to somebody, come lend me a hand, and what I mean is I want you to help me. I don't mean chop off your hand and give it to me.
Exactly. Another one, in fact, that is ironically used with the under the heaven. So in it's chapter 7, verse 19, I think it is specifically, where young creationists will be like, well, now you can't get out of this because it says water covered all the earth under all the heaven. Now, do a Hebrew word search for all the heaven. It only appears 2 other times in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, now this is where scholarship like Michael Heiser comes into play, because he loves to harp on, and I think it's absolutely brilliant, which to be honest, I recommend you have him on your podcast sometime.
Oh, I'd love to. He's got the YouTube channel Fringe Pop, and I love watching that stuff. It's really fun.
But his Unseen Realm book, which is based on Psalm 82, but I believe the crux of his entire argumentation is Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 to 9, where that verse is actually a summary of the Babel story. So Deuteronomy 8 says, when the Most High divided up the nations, he separated the sons of humanity according to the number of the gods. And that last phrase is depending on how you do, because the King James says number of the sons of Israel, and the Dead Sea Scrolls says according to the number of the sons of God, which when you paraphrase sons of God in the Hebrew there, it literally means divine beings, the number of the divine beings. So obviously the Dead Sea Scroll reading is more accurate and more original and authentic. So when you go to the Babel story and you see the division of the nations, where do we see that? In Genesis 10? Where are the nations distributed? Under the whole heaven? In that Mediterranean region. The 70 nations that are listed, which then reappear in Acts chapter 2, when the same 70 nations come back to hear the gospel message, and the reversal of the... So what happened at Babel, so the dispersion of the nations, is now a rejoining of the nations, where Jesus didn't have to bow his knee to Satan, when Satan said, bow and I'll give you all these nations back, because remember, you dispersed them. Well, Jesus will get them back by not bowing down to Satan. So the point is, that phrase, under all the heaven, is also in that limited geographical location, in both times that it appears. So again, it's part of that, all the land, under all the sky. Again, it makes perfect sense if it's in this region. And by the way, that would be, if you're talking 700 100,000 square kilometers worth of water coverage. Guess what? You can only see about 12 kilometers out, and then the horizon just dips down. So if it's water, it'll look like water everywhere.
From the perspective of whoever survived, it's going to essentially look like, well, water's covering the whole Earth, even though, technically speaking, it wasn't.
And you see this very specifically with the dove. So in chapter 8, now this is where, again, textual criticism comes into play, because the textual critics are like, oh, here's the Yahwist coming into play, and he's contradicting the priestly source. And because in Genesis 8, you have the text saying that Noah was noticing that water was evaporating from certain regions in the distance, and he could see land appearing, and especially some mountains as well appearing. So he sends the dove out. Then the text says the dove couldn't find any resting place because water still covered all the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So then the textual critic is like, oh, see, there's a contradiction because it says all the earth, and just the prior verse it's saying not all the earth. So which is it? Oh, see, there's a contradiction in the text. Well, excuse me, but elevation heights play a factor here, because Noah from a certain elevation is seeing, land, and the dove, which won't fly very high, because the text is saying that the dove was flying quite low on the surface of the water, and that's an interesting specific detail as well. So from the dove's perspective in its local vicinity, obviously there's nothing to find.
Yeah, if you've ever been in water or a big lake, when you're actually in it down near the surface of the water, you can't see much. Get up on a boat or something, and you're going to be able to see much, much further. Yeah.
So that natural reading, I don't see a problem in that type of reading. Like, why not? That seems a very plausible reading, just from perspective. So that's, and then obviously you have the landings of Mount Judy, which has been part of tradition, and so as far as just the flood narrative goes, that's probably the best, most simplest way I can approach this. And so there's a lot of material I've written on this. The last bit would be then, what about elsewhere in the Bible? And we'll sort of summarize this because I know it's sort of the time's running out. So Psalm 104, Job 38, Proverbs 8. These are all key creation texts that, very interestingly, all speak about, in their own unique way, what's happening on day 1 and what's happening on day 3 of creation. And all of them say that day 1 is about a globally covered water world. Like Earth was originally this water world. Whether you talk about a ancient Near Eastern cosmology, which is a flat, more like a water void, really, and then this land that sort of appears out of this void. So in that sense, obviously everything is water. Or, as we understand it in modern science, that you had a water world that's dark on the surface.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Psalm 104 starts like this. In fact, and I use the International Standard Version. It's the ISV Bible. Basically, the committee that worked on the ESV and the NIV and the NASB, in 2014, they released this ISV translation, which is brilliant. So just quickly, Genesis 3 describes the serpent, but as Heiser points out, you should translate it as an adjective, and so
not a noun, but it's describing the creature.
You're right, and then so the ISV says the shining one was more wise than any animal on the beast of the field. So it's a divine being, not the serpent lurking around or a snake, lurking around. So anyway, so the ISV is sensitive to that. And so in Psalm 104 verse 6, the ISV renders it as that the primeval ocean covered the earth. And because don't forget, Psalm 104 is David's polemical response to the Artland creation hymn. He's thinking of Genesis 1 verse 2. The primeval waters cover the earth. Verses 7 and 8 is then his, which is remarkably accurate in my opinion, is his tectonic sort of activity, that the mountains rise, valleys sink to the places that you've ordained for them, and that ordination fits very well with the fine-tuning argument, because, as Hugh Ross will point out, you need the exact continental size and the carbonate silicate cycle to work a certain particular way for life to emerge and all that. In fact, a paper in June of last year, instead of I'll just be very brief, but you have the original model was you have a static sort of landmass that just emerges. Then, because of uranium and thorium isotope and rubidium and osmium isotope analysis, you have this model of it's instead of landmasses appearing like that, it's actually a slow build-up of an accumulation of landmass over time due to volcanic, volcanism. And then then they were like, okay, maybe it's a linear line increase of landmass. Then it slowly became this exponential increase in landmass, and now it's like a flat line, and then literally like a vertical line up at a particular point in Earth's history, which is about halfway in its scale. So about 2 billion years into its history, bam, landmass appears. Isn't that interesting? Because day 3 is halfway between day 1 and 6 that you have land appearing. So David says, mountains rise, valleys sink to the places you've ordained. Then verse 9 says, and never again will the primeval waters of verse 6 cover the earth the way it did in verse 6. Like never again will it become a Genesis 1 verse 2 water world again. Now that it's set in place, it's set. Job 38 mentions the same thing. Bars and doors are so that the waves will only come this far and no more. Proverbs 8, the wisdom speaking in that passage, which I believe is Jesus, that when he creates the circle of the deep, he puts like barriers and so on. So if Noah's flood is global, then David and, traditionally Solomon in Proverbs and Job in Job 38, like they're all contradicting what clearly should be a global flood that you see later in Genesis.
Yeah.
So that's if the younger Christians has to be consistent with that. You have to go. There's a contradiction in Scripture if you hold to it. Otherwise, if you're going to take Scripture seriously, then we should avoid that.
Yeah, and what I found when I talked to young Earth creationists is they don't even really tend to go that sophisticated. They tend to more look at it, be like, well, look what the later authors in Scripture said. They clearly thought Noah's flood actually happened, therefore it did. And they kind of miss the point of the types of arguments you just made there, where you're like, well, of course they thought it actually happened. They just don't think it happened in the way you think it happened. They're not saying it wasn't history. They do think it was history. They just don't agree with your interpretation of it.
Yeah. And I've had younger Christians like Nephilim Free online. I would consider them to be the more fringe, like Ken Hovind and Nephilim Free. So when I've introduced Psalm 104 to them, they're like, oh, then maybe it's speaking of both. Maybe the text is describing both the flood and the creation at the same time. And I'm just thinking to myself, no, you've just totally ignored my build-up of the thesis that David is talking to the Egyptians. Like there's a reason why he's written what he's written. And anyway. But so the last one would be, or the last two observations is the fact that, isn't it interesting that Noah's flood is never really discussed throughout the Bible, except in very sparingly only once in Isaiah. Isaiah 51.
That's true. There's like allusions to it and like maybe an offhand reference made to Noah, but it's not like anybody goes in depth reanalyzing the story or anything like that.
There's no opinion of it was a global flood or it was this and that. It's just there in the text and they don't discuss it, which I find quite curious. When you go to the New Testament, Jesus doesn't really describe the parameters of the flood. But yet Peter does something very interesting in chapters 2 and 3 of 2 Peter. So in chapter 2, he juxtaposes the scope of the judgment of the flood with Sodom and Gomorrah, because apparently the two have an antithetical type and antitype of each other. Was Sodom and Gomorrah global? No.
Absolutely not.
And so I find that interesting in chapter 2. And the flood is described as destroying the world of the ungodly, which is not just cosmos. There's a qualifier to that word cosmos. The world of the ungodly has to be localized in a certain location. Then chapter 3 is a very interesting one because verse 6 says, and the world at that time was deluged with water. Now, the King James onlyists and all that will read, the world at that time. Oh, yeah, the earth at that time. That's how they'll usually read it. Interestingly, if you look at tote, the Greek word, tote cosmos, so tote is the qualifier with cosmos. You have lexical dictionaries like the Theological Dictionary in the New Testament. They'll actually take that phrase, do a word search, and do like a word analysis of that combination. It can be translated as humanity at that time was deluged with water. So now you're not even talking geography, because usually that's in the English rendering we sort of think geographically the world at that time. No, it's a whole other meaning in that word, meaning the word cosmos here now means the world of the ungodly, or the humanity at that time was daily. Now, where was humanity? Was humanity globalized? No, humanity was bottlenecked, like as the anthropologists have been pointing out, in that Persian Gulf region.
I see. Interesting. Yeah.
So even fast forwarding to Peter, it's interesting that you have this localizing sort of fixativity, like it's a rigid parameter of this is what God's focusing on. And now, as a shadow, if God's judgment was so harsh, even in that local sense, now He's going to do it in a universal, global sense. Like he destroyed with water, but now He'll do it with fire, and even the elements will annihilate and burn. And so when I approach it like that, it's like now when you're thinking about the end times, now I'm much more afraid of the judgment of God.
Yeah, no kidding.
If he's going to do a universal judgment again, it's like, oh yeah, it's like what's new sort of thing. It's nothing new under the sun in that sense. But yeah. So
now, one thing I did want to bring up, since you told me that you take like a concordant view of Genesis, is I'm curious to see how you respond to this, because I've heard Hugh Ross's variant of this, and I think you can apply this to both what his variant of it is and many other ones. The concern I have is, as we talked about earlier, the best way to interpret any text is in light of what the original author intended. But so what most of these types of views do is they look for contemporary science in Genesis, but it just seems to me so blatantly obvious that Moses, or if somebody else wrote Genesis, they didn't have contemporary science in mind, so it couldn't have been part of their authorial intention. And so that's the thing that makes me suspicious of that type of way of interpreting Genesis. So how do you respond to that type of worry?
So, in other words, are we being a little bit too esoteric in our reading of the creation narrative by just seeing science wherever we can?
Sort of, yeah. And I know you're not doing this like in bad faith, honestly, or something. But that's the concern I have, is that a fundamental principle I use when I look at any text, biblical otherwise, it is what was the author's intention. And unless you're willing to go with some type of dictation theory of inspiration where God is literally putting the exact words into like Moses's or whoever's mind, then you've got a problem if you're seeing contemporary, at least very sophisticated contemporary scientific theories, because they didn't exist then in humanity. So how could Moses or whoever invented it? So that's the concern I have. And I want to, since that's the viewpoint you tend to take, I want to know how you respond to that type of worry or attention.
Exactly, and I think so without going into so I'm talking if Hugh Ross was in the room, this is what I'd be telling him, without falling into the trap of private interpretation. Let's just say, like, to use Peter's lingo there. And in fact, Hugh Ross, I think, would agree with me on this, and that is, let science, the book of nature, do its thing. We derive data and information out of that. Let scripture do its thing. But what I find interesting is that the book of nature is it's not it's very blunt. It's you can derive quite a bit. There's a lot of questions. I mean, quantum mechanics is a whole basket case of confusion going on. But
yeah, definitely.
The point is, maths at the end of the day is just yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore your interpretation is just that. It's just whatever the math says, and you just stick with that. But as for something as so gray, like the gradient is not black and white. It's just this big chasm of a mix in between of white and black. With respect to literature and how and you were sort of alluding to this, like there are people who derive modern feminist ideas out of Shakespeare, and yet that's a wrong way of going about Shakespeare. But there are people that do that.
Yeah. I've read some of them. Unfortunately, I don't recommend it. So.
Right. So, but you see, that's the unfortunate thing with that side of the arts versus science, which is very rigid, and because math is like, to use binary as an analogy, it's 1 and 0. That's there's no in between 1 and 0, so to speak, in binary mathematics. So that's, at least that's fortunate from the science, but it's unfortunate in the art, in the literature side of things. I don't know another word for literature, but the arts, anything to do with language.
You could just say humanities in general.
Humanities, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, some of them I would say you could call them like soft sciences, like social sciences like psychology or sociology and things along those lines, where they're in a certain sense a science, but they're not the same thing as like geology, chemistry, and biology and stuff like that. So
right. So keeping that in mind, then what we have to do is try and approach then the Genesis text, and not just Genesis, obviously things like Shakespeare and other ancient Near Eastern documents, the way we do proper good science. And that is, see if we can have a 1 or a 0, black and white sort of derivation from this text, even though we know it's much easier to become misinterpreted. Mm-hmm. So so earlier on in the discussion when I mentioned this would be my appeal to Hugh Ross to give respect to people like John Walton, because the ancient Near Eastern scholarship that he's provided and scholars like him, it's legit. This is what the ancients were thinking. This is why the text is written the way it is written. But then at the same time, say a Second Temple scholar will then pop into the discussion and be like, or like a New Testament scholar will be like, yeah, but isn't it interesting that you have what's called pesher exegesis? Pesher is a fancy way of saying interpretation in the Second Temple period. So you have the New Testament authors like Matthew taking Hosea 11:1, and I guess you could say he's doing like how the feminists misinterpret Shakespeare. He's doing like you're misinterpreting Hosea, man. Like, what the heck's going on? Mm-hmm. But the further you dig into that, the way Matthew goes about it, it's a type of pesher that's legit, and he's concording an actual historical thing taking place, which is Jesus going into Egypt, and he's seeing the parallel between Israel, the son of God, and Jesus, the son of God. Like, it works in that sense. So then here comes this is where the rubber hits the road. Those type of Christians will say, but Matthew, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, has the authority to do that. But you, Hugh Ross, you are not an apostle, so you don't have the authority to concord Genesis in that same manner. Even though there's the coincidence of exactly what we see in Earth's natural history, like in Genesis 1 verse 2, and say the birds coming out of the oceans. But you don't have the authority to do that. It's just conjecture at the end of the day. And so then this goes into a whole other line of argumentation of what it means, how to interpret Scripture from the church moving forward. And this falls under the category of the Roman Catholic debates with the Protestants and tradition versus sola scriptura, prima scriptura, all that stuff. That's the next discussion.
Yeah. And I wouldn't make that kind of objection. The reason I bring that up is I'm not necessarily saying that what's going on here is people like you and Hugh Ross are reading contemporary science back into Genesis, and that you shouldn't do that. I say when I see you doing that, that's immediately what my worry is this happening? How could we figure out if it is happening? And if it's not, how do we determine that? Where I just think that's a concern that should naturally come up with the type of view you're taking. Not to say that like you're wrong about that, but that's like kind of, so to speak, an objection that I think you need to try to deal with, as you just did. So
exactly.
Yeah.
So I, in fact, Hugh Ross and myself and actually John Walton, we would all just sit together and actually hold hands and go, it's a type of soft concordism where, and in fact, I have scriptural evidence where Christians can do this. I have, in fact, this appeal that you need to be the authority, like the apostolic authority to do what Matthew does or something. Paul says this in Ephesians 3 and 4, and very specifically he says, now that God has done all this that he's done, now through the church, his never-ending, and it's a beautiful word in the Greek, this manifold, like constant unveiling of God's wisdom it's literally like in the future, constantly being unveiled over time, through the church. So now the church is the vehicle by which God, and now obviously this fits with Pentecost moving forward, that if we are the body of Jesus and we are the temple of God and we are meant to, have God, work through us sort of thing. That also includes what is one of the gifts that Paul labels? Teachers, educators, thinking like scientists, for example. And so this was the emergence of the scientific method after this type of thinking, which is remarkable because you had a superstitious type of thinking in the Greco-Roman context. They die out. Who are the non-superstitious people? The Christians. Naturally, they're the natural scientists that start to emerge, and then again, this notion of through the church, God's wisdom is being unveiled. So then, why not the remarkable amount of commentaries that we see commentating on Genesis, unveiling the scriptures? Then, when we go into the ancient Near East, then even more information is being unveiled. I think that's a remarkable gift that God has given us for us to forever sort of unveil the reasons why we give glory to Jesus for what he's done. It's like being a Berean, to use that phrase, search the scriptures. Like there's nothing wrong in using your own mind and actually, whatever question that was asked before, okay, actually now I may have discovered a solution to that, and on it goes.
That's how you should do scriptural interpretation, is in light of the scripture, good principles of interpretation like authorial intention, but then also within a Christian community. So like if I come up with something that seems really right to me, seems to fit, but is way off basis, then the community can say to me, no, Phil, that doesn't work. You're crazy. Come on, get back in line.
I'll give you a quick example, especially for your audience.
Yeah.
Ask your audience. And I actually did this with Nephilim Free, one of the young creationists on YouTube. I asked him in a debate, what is Ezekiel 1 trying to describe? Now you...
Wheel within the wheel one?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Now what do you think that is?
I have no idea, honestly. It's baffling to me. So
okay, so now this is important for this in this context, because then you'll have Christians saying, okay, let's like say there's a Christian group about to do a Bible study on Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, obviously, all Bible study groups start with prayer. And so, Holy Spirit, we pray that you'll illuminate this passage for me, that sort of thing. I bet you 99% of the time that Bible study groups have done that on that passage, or passages like that, would not have got the right interpretation of that passage. Because you'll have like you've seen it online. The wheels is a UFO.
Oh, I've heard that a lot.
Yeah, like stuff like that. If it wasn't for the scholarship, which ironically is what Paul describes in Ephesians 3 and 4, that Christians, the unveiling of God's wisdom will be generated, and then so the scholarship that's gone into Babylonian iconography has now shown what Ezekiel is actually describing, and that is the Babylonian zodiac. So,
interesting. Okay.
So notice you have the 4 living creatures with certain faces. Well, those are the cardinal points of 4 particular constellation signs. And the wheel is because the constellations are in their cosmology are like strapped to like a wheel-like structure around a geocentric Earth. And so the wheel, so here you have the Earth, and then the wheel of the constellations go around the Earth like this. And then when it says that the eyes cover the wheel, or the eyes cover the creatures all over the body, well, the Hebrew word for eye can mean star. So naturally, when you see, say, Virgo, you see the stars clothing Virgo. And so now what is the imagery? Ezekiel is telling the Babylonians, it's not Marduk or your Babylonian gods that control the cycles of time. It's Yahweh enthroned above that controls the zodiacal cycles of time. And then this leads into the Star of Bethlehem thing, and this is a whole other discussion where I showcase how Babylonian astrologers like the Magi, with this sort of imagery, they are able to then know, the timing of Jesus' birth. And the Star of Bethlehem is Jupiter, actually, that they were following.
I've heard that theory before, yeah.
So notice how just a little bit of scholarship just completely just makes it so simple. Oh, yeah. The 4 living, like, why 4? Why this wheel or the eyes in the wheel? Like now now you're sitting in the shoes of Ezekiel, in Babylon, and it makes sense. It's like you're there with him. So, but notice, it's like scholarship now in the 20th or 21st century, now looking back, and then like with fresh eyes, you're reading the text. Now, I don't have apostolic authority to do that, and yet I've just unveiled the text, and it makes a lot of sense now. Why can't people like Hugh Ross do the same, concording it with, say, science, because God knows science is that's not wrong. And then why not John Walton in his, to flip the coin on the other side, why not John Walton in the ancient Near Eastern sense showcase what the text is saying for the ancient Near Eastern people at the same time?
That's a very good point. Good turnaround.
And you can have both at the same time, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, Interesting. All right. Let's see. Well, I guess we're pushing up on the end. There was 2 other things I really wanted to ask you, and the first is, why do you think this is like an important issue? Why does it matter whether or not Noah's flood was global or regional, aside from the fact that it gives us fun, interesting discussions, and it's really cool to dig into, and I enjoy it, and obviously you do too. But aside from that, why is it important? And then where would you place issues like this on a level of importance? Like, are they like essential to being a Christian to get this right? Or they have secondary importance where you would have to go to a different denomination, or they're even lesser importance than that, where you don't have trouble attending the same church and worshiping with somebody who thinks differently than you do about these kind of things?
Honestly, now I thought, especially in my early walk as a Christian, obviously I had no clue about all the stuff that I'm sharing with you. This is 10 years so far. Like, imagine after 10 years what will happen. But at the time, I thought, no, you have to prove it. You have to, like, the Adam and Eve story has to be proven. Noah's flood story has to be proven. The Exodus has to be proven. Or it has to be read this way and then no other way. now I've become so relaxed and happy and comfortable with it being okay if there are no at the moment answers for certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, Jesus is it for me. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what he did, why he came, 1 Corinthians 15, that whole charisma, what is the gospel, that sort of thing. So,
if God rose Jesus from the dead, Christianity's true, and the other things are details we need to work out. Yeah.
I mean, just then, say if I never mentioned Ezekiel 1 to you about the zodiac, and by God's timing, in his will, you and I pass on X number of years from now, not knowing what Ezekiel meant in that sense. And then in heaven, you and I discuss it. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you that Ezekiel meant this. Like, would you then complain to me, you should have told me that, because then my denominational perspective would be, in this certain direction, and it would mean nothing. It's just an interesting fact of history that it's about the zodiac. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing applies to the flood. Same thing applies to the now. It is important and fascinating to investigate these things, for the sake of what it is. But that doesn't then. It should not be a hill to die on. It should not. I hate to say this, but your guest, and I showed you, where very clearly I was labeled as being a sinner for being a theistic evolutionist.
Yeah, I was disappointed when you sent me that, because she was far more gracious about these things than when I interviewed her on the podcast, more or less agreeing that, this isn't a salvation issue, even though she thought it was very, very important.
Yeah, salvation issue. Yeah. So is it okay, since you did not know that the zodiac was in Ezekiel 1, you're going to hell. It's nonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
Did the flood happen? Well, now I have a lot of evidence to comfortably say, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not a few years ago, but definitely now. But was I saved a few years ago for not knowing the answer? Yes, because I believed in Jesus. So, I think when it comes down to the whole, 2 Timothy 3, God is the scriptures is theopneustos, God breathes, and it's used for correction, proof, all that stuff. I think it's just a never-ending, unfolding application of the scriptures that can provide meaning and purpose and reproof, especially in my life, like that a lot of reproof has been required, and like a change of mind, like a renewing of the mind. And if I can't prove Noah's flood at the moment, okay, but there's a lot of lessons I can learn from that story.
Oh yeah.
And it's not a salvation, issue. I'm not going to judge Ken Hovind and Ken Ham for building especially Ken Ham for building that huge ark and deceiving a lot of people the way he's doing it. Like, I'm actually worried. In fact, one of my friend, a good friend of mine, Ben Stanhope, he just released a video called Archaeological Sins that the Creation Museum does.
I watched that just the other day or the day before, yeah. I know what you're talking about.
Do you notice how deceptive that actually is, especially with that particular wall drawing of that supposed huge dinosaur bird, when actually it's a human standing on this side and another human on that side.
Oh yeah, the one that really got me is them claiming that in Beowulf, the Grendel and the mother are dinosaurs.
Yeah.
I love Beowulf. As I said, I love stories. I love English literature. I've read that. Right. I've gone through scholarly articles on that. There is no way that is in any way referring to a dinosaur. I think he even made a video. Have these people even read Beowulf? Because if you have, that's impossible.
Right. So, honestly, Phil, I'm using that as an example is very as well. I think all Christians, to be humble here, even I could be basically what James says, that the educator is under greater judgment. We can all fall into that trap of a slip up, and then we can lead astray of a huge amount, even if it's a small slip up.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the gray area. It's like, do you do it intentionally, or do you do it without realizing it? Most of the time, it's not realizing it.
Yeah.
But the young creationists, like you saw in that video, it's bordering on intentional. Now, I'm not going to judge their salvation, but boy, they should rethink what they're actually doing, because that is not only is that deceiving those people, but when those people find out that they've been duped, you then get the militant atheists like Aaron Rav and Paul Gia and Matt Dillahunty, that were these ex-young creationists. How ironic! They're these ex-young creationists that are now doing what they're doing online,
it's kind of simplistic always to like attribute like a decision a single human being makes to just only one thing, but it does seem that a common factor in a lot of these people is they were told you've got to choose between Christianity and evolution, and then they get hit with what seems to them at least to be very, very good evidence for evolution, and so they just throw up their hands and say, well, it's got to be evolution instead of Christianity. And we didn't get into this. I say this as somebody who's still fairly skeptical of a lot of aspects of evolutionary theory, but you don't have to choose between the two of them. You can be a Christian and believe in evolution. And then whether or not it's right is another question that we should talk about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. Well, we covered a lot of ground. This has been really fun, really awesome. Yeah. Since we're pushing up on 3 hours, I suppose we should probably.
Well, we have 10 more minutes, so if you want to fill that up, I don't mind. Yeah.
Do you have any upcoming videos or projects going on your channel you'd like people to be aware of, or anything that my podcast listeners could know about? Or
so the Bible studies that I've been writing for this local group. So we've gone through Ephesians and currently going through Revelation. So that's basically going to be my next project. It's called the Sentinel Commentary on Ephesians and Revelation. I've already made 2 playlists. So I've already uploaded, I think I've done 4 for Ephesians and 2 for Revelation.
Fantastic.
So basically what I do is I just read the study. So the study is designed where I have an opening thought. It's a question. It's a discussion question. I have a brief background of the passage. Then we read the passage, and then questions on every couple of verses of the passage. But then after we discuss the question, there's a very lengthy answer of basically me paraphrasing at least 20 different commentaries and scholarly papers on that passage, truncated into, so thousands of pages worth of material truncated into like 20 pages of study. And so the video is basically me taking the study, just doing it as if we were doing an actual study, and then putting the graphics, putting the text. And so it's like everyone can read along while I read the study, along with the graphics and so on. And it's a wonderful blend of modern scholarship alongside the patristic writers, because I include a lot of the patristic quotes to show what they were thinking as well. And then I'll put like a little patristic like icon, like Origin's icon I'll put at the side, and then I'll put this text. And so you guys check it out, and that'll be my project. Basically, I designed it to be 12 studies per book. So I've already finished the 12 for Ephesians in written form. And so I'm up to the 4th study, basically. Same thing with Revelation, 12 studies for Revelation, but I'm up to the 2nd in video form. And the other projects I've done, and it's completed. So I did a whole commentary on the Matrix movie.
Oh, interesting.
And I call it a cyberpunk parable. Basically, I love it. I love the Matrix, and it's a 16. Great, yeah. It's a 16-part video of me again reading the transcript. Well, a friend of mine did the voice work for the first 5 episodes, and then I take over from episode 6 onwards. And basically, it's scene by scene of the Matrix movie.
Interesting. Okay.
Starting with Neo sleeping at his desk. Wake up, Neo. The Matrix has you. I don't want to spoil it, but you'll be blown away.
I'll have to check that.
It blew me away when I was doing it. So
I really did enjoy that movie, and the first one actually does have some real depth and meat to it. They kind of lost that 2 sequels, but the first one really does have some depth and meat to it. So yeah.
Notice just quickly, this will be a tiny taster. Earlier when I mentioned about how evolution and how Jesus affects the whole cosmos in his death, burial, resurrection, because he's connected to the whole cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
In Revolutions, when Neo...
Yeah, I see where you're going.
You know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah, I remember the movie.
Yeah, and then all the Smiths are connected to him, and he affects the whole... Yeah, So that's the type of connections I make in that series. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean that they didn't try in the sequels. I just don't think the philosophy and analogies and allusions they were making worked as well in the sequels as they did in the first one. The first one was a very, very well-crafted film where it all fit together very well. And they tried in the second and third one, and some of the action sequences in the second one are spectacular. But the deeper part of it, it just didn't work quite as well in the second and third one as it did in the first one. That's all.
It's basically... I see what you're saying with that. Maybe I'm too much of a hard fanboy to criticize second and third because I love them equally. But I think what you're saying is, and I agree with what you're saying, it's kind of like The Rise of Skywalker. I don't know if you've seen The Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, my wife made me get out of the house to go see a movie a couple of weeks ago, and that was the only one that was playing that was in any way interesting. So, yeah.
The pacing of the prior movies compared to this, yeah, it's night and day. And it's the same thing with The Matrix, but yeah.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, The Matrix Reloaded still has the absolute best car chase sequence ever filmed in it.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody can come close to outdoing that. So.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, and so if people who would watch your YouTube channel are interested, they can find my podcast, The Examine Life with Phil.
Sure.
I got a Facebook group for it where I post things periodically. As I mentioned, I think before, just last week, I did a debate with somebody on inerrancy, and I've got the whole video of that up on there if they want to go watch that. That was a lot of fun. It was a formal academic debate, and we actually had about 60 people there actually in the audience watching it. I was very pleasantly surprised that people actually were interested in watching a formal debate on inerrancy.
Yeah. I'm gonna check that out. You're the person on the far right, aren't you, in the video?
Yeah, I'm wearing the black sport jacket. There's
a few guys with beards.
Yeah,
except the guy on the far left. And
yeah. They were. It turned out that there were 2 moderators, and they sat in the center. And then it was me versus David Van Beber, who's a pastor locally here. He actually set the whole thing up and asked me to participate. And he was more or less arguing that this is kind of a very loose characterization. If the Bible says it has to be the truth, all or nothing. And I was trying to say, well, no, it's not necessarily that simple, kind of very similar to what you and I were talking about. You've got to consider the context. You've got to consider all these other things. And my main point is these people thought and wrote about things differently than we do now. So most of the time when we see errors like the Matthew to Hosea example we talked about, it's not an error. It's us reading our contemporary understanding of things back in the text. And I would go so far as to say, I bet you 90 to 95% of the time people point to contradictions or problems in the Bible. That's what's going on, is they're failing to recognize these people didn't write and record things like we do now. It just didn't work that way. So,
and just to sort of, and this can be like a closing, especially for you, because I can go on, but
I think I need to finish up and go make dinner for my family. So, yeah.
Right. So, just quickly, another, thing that came to mind some time ago when I was thinking exactly about this, and that is, for example, when you have fundamentalist groups that say, oh, women can't preach, or women can't, there can't be any women part because of this passage in Timothy. Well, say if you were existing at the time before Paul even wrote that to Timothy, there's no mention of that now. Now what do you do? Do you hinder women? Like, isn't it interesting that it's not some block of text that just fell out of the sky? There's this evolution of the information that God wants the church to know over time, theologically speaking. Another one, head covering. So 1 Corinthians 11, verse 14 and 15, Paul is quoting Greco-Roman medical texts. The Greek word parabolaion, which in our English translation that says covering, can be translated testicle. So a woman's hair is given as a substitute for testicles. Oh my gosh! Now what's going on here? Like, now you just what the heck? Now you have to go back to the drawing board. What does Paul mean? Because of the scholarship now that's established that word can mean testicle, and Paul's utilizing medical Greek texts. Now you've done away with the head covering fundamentalists that no, women have to cover their head. It's basically describing that what women lack, which is male testicles, and women were known as castrated males, like that's the way they were seen.
Yeah, that was a common idea in like Greco-Roman
right
thinking. Yeah,
right. So, but for some reason, men are very hairy, but women are not that hairy, and most of the hair is on the head. And they conceived that the fetus was conceived up in the head first, and so for the sperm to reach up into the head, the long hair acted as a sponge to absorb, and so therefore, if that's part of the genitalia, meaning that's the substitute for what they lack, and that is testicles, then you cover your hair because you don't want to walk into a church naked, with your hair exposed. Which is interesting with Jesus, because notice that the prostitute using her hair to wash Jesus' feet, notice that they were sort of cringing at that. They were like, "Oh my God!"
That makes more sense as to why they were cringing at that. Then
there you go. But Jesus being God, yeah. So Jesus being God looks past that and teaches them a lesson about hospitality, and so that's a beautiful story when you see it that way.
Cool.
I was going to give you another example, but I think we should end it there. But
well, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about all this. I very, very much enjoyed it, especially since you had to start so very, very early in the morning where you're at, and it's like 7 o'clock there now. So you started at 4 a.m.
It's all good. Now it's the perfect time for a surf. So
you're going to go out and surfing after this?
Most likely. Yeah. Okay, it's summer over here. So
very cool. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this. And if you ever want to talk anything at all again, more than welcome. If you see something on my podcast or essay I wrote, you want to talk to me about, that's great, or anything at all, because I love good discussions like this. And it's all great content for my podcast, so I don't have to scrimp up and come up with something the day before it's due. So
right. And you should have, I think, to be honest, we should have maybe a panel discussion, bring IP on, myself, maybe Scarlett as well, if you want, just so we can sort of flesh it all out now that you've.
You mentioned that before, and that's a very good idea. I'll try and go about contacting people to see if they would be interested in that. Obviously you'd be willing to do that. I know IP has done similar things like that before in the past, but his time tends to be precious because everybody wants him for everything. So, but it'd be very cool if we could set that up. Yeah, I'll try and check into that.
Yeah, no stress or rush on that. So
that'd be normally when I do a series like this, like I'm doing now, I end it by me giving my thoughts and summaries. But if we could end it with a panel or something, that would be really, really cool too. So
right, yeah.
Now I'm kind of cutting it off here because, as I said, I left the live stream that I was doing with Rob there to go make dinner for my family. He actually went on and did a Q&A with his listeners, I think, for a whole nother hour after that. So good for him. So if you want to, instead of listening to the podcast, just watch Rob and I discuss this on YouTube. You can go to his YouTube channel, Sentinel Apologetics, and watch that there. And he's got plenty of other good content there that you should check out as well anyway. So just, as always, write in, let me know what you think about this podcast episode, the whole discussion Rob and I did on the theory of Noah's flood being regional. As I think I mentioned last week, I'm of the opinion that there's probably something to this theory. The evidence for it seems to be fairly strong. There's ways you can interpret the text that lead to that don't seem very contrived or ad hoc. So I think there probably is something to this theory. I think it probably more or less works. So, as always, write and let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment or question at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or I started a Facebook group for the podcast. You can just type in a search for The Examined Life with Phil. It should pop right up. Like it, send me a message there, leave me a comment or whatever. I'll be happy to get back to you. And as I always mention, I try to share interesting or fun and useful things on there, regardless of what's going on in the podcast. Well, just for example, today as I'm recording this, but it'll be yesterday by the time you hear this, I found a link to a free philosophy book on the challenges to religion from evolution from Cambridge, and I put that up on the Facebook page so other people could check it out. And those are the kind of things I like to do. It's not always funny. Some of it's good content like that. So anyhow, next week I'll be back with more of this series. I'm going to do a presentation on old Earth creationism because that's, I think, probably about the only view I haven't covered yet, and I happen to espouse that view, so I figured I'd just do that myself and give you all the reasons why I think we can be pretty confident the world is much, much older than 6,000 years, and that's perfectly fine, and it squares very, very well with the Bible, no problem. So I'll be back with that next week, and as always, thanks for listening.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.